I think that true liberation is really just acceptance. I think it's allowing yourself to be as you are and allowing the world to be as it is without constant reference and constant reprimand of yourself for, what you lack in life and in your inadequacies as it pertains to what's inside of you. I think that a lot of us will be granted the potential to grow as soon as we grant ourselves the potential to be where we are. I think a lot of times we, in a way, take ourselves away from the present moment or take ourselves away from ourselves and our inability to accept who we are as we are. And I think the overall importance in life is to accept yourself as you are. I think the liberating aspect of that is not necessarily to say that as soon as you accept yourself, everything that contains you will be gone, but to say that as soon as you accept yourself, you're no longer containing stuff within yourself. I think, it's not what contains us that keeps us stuck, but what we contain within ourselves. And I think, we sort of have to open ourselves up to our own inadequacies at times. I feel like we have to look at ourselves in a full picturesque way, not necessarily focusing solely on the positives, not necessarily focusing solely on the negatives. I think it's about acknowledgement of the whole of your character so you can embrace certain parts and you can acknowledge certain parts enough to let them go. And I think that's what allows life to be lived in the present moment, is not constantly positing this idea that you are not worthy of where you are, that you don't belong where you are. The only space you take up is yours and no one else can fill up that space. I was writing about that earlier in a sense to say that, our preoccupation with other people's place, maybe other people's competition with you, or comparisons to others, all of it really has no place in the role of our desires and goals. If that person achieves this, does that mean you can't? And the answer is oftentimes no. So it doesn't matter what other people do. It doesn't matter how other people tend towards their own development. It doesn't matter if someone else is mean and you are nice. Who we are is not to be referenced to other people. It's to be experienced by us. And I think if we constantly are only looking at ourselves from how we are experienced, then we lose a lot of the experience. We lose a lot of our ability to be where we are and enjoy what's here. And I've recognized a lot recently that enjoyment of being here is just contentment with the choices that you make, not necessarily the thoughts that you have. I'm realizing that thinking isn't the objective, making good choices is. I think when we posit thinking as our objective and we and we don't really allow ourselves to make choices, I guess, and we don't really allow ourselves to be outside of our thoughts, we tend to think that our thoughts define us. And if we think our thoughts define us, then they do. Like if you ask yourself, do I have power over my mind? And your mind says no, then you obviously don't. But what we don't recognize is that it's just a thought. It's just a thought we may have. And I think we need to recognize how driving our thoughts are to our actions and how they don't necessarily need to be. I think that doing your best is very important and being authentic to yourself. Authenticity, humanity, compassion, and open-mindedness. I think that our awareness of ourselves and acceptance of ourselves is what allows us to act in accordance to what we actually want, rather than just being dependent on the way we have been in the past and the way that other people have labeled us and the way we've been labeled by what we experience and pretty much everything in that regard. Confident expectancy is also something I think is very important. I think we need to stop degrading our path and thinking that one failure means we no longer can do something. I think a lot of times when we fail, we tend to get in our head, oh, that was my one chance at trying. Oh, that was my one chance at this. And I no longer have that path, that opportunity. And I think when it comes to our actual innate desires and things that we actually want to do for ourselves, whether that just be for ourselves or whatever, it needs to be done for you. And I think it needs to be acknowledged as something that can be done regardless of how many times it ends up in quote unquote failure. I think a lot of us fail because, we aren't ready to accept the medicine that the world has to bring to us at times. I think sometimes our failure is just another obstacle that we face mentally that tells us whether or not we need to sharpen a certain part of ourselves, or gain more in this, or maybe it was just the wrong time. But I'm realizing it's not really about the wrong time. It's about being the right person. And I think being the right person should be more of our objective than our actual objective. Because if we're solely focused on the outcome, solely focused on the very end of our path, then the person walking it won't get the necessary amount of validation, attention, and affection it needs to be strengthened to overcome the obstacles that exist in the present. You know, if we only focus on the end, then we don't really encounter anything here. And I think in that way, we're not really fixed to find solutions to our problems. We're fixed to perpetuate them, fixed to avoid them, fixed to avoid ourselves in a lot of ways. I think you can't accept yourself if you can't accept the world, and vice versa. You know, I think what we see in the world in terms of people's conduct, this, that, and the other, if we can't accept our negativity, accept our positivity, accept our dualities, accept our multitudes, then we won't be able to accept that in others. And I don't necessarily mean that in terms of negative, immoral stuff. I don't mean that at all. I mean that more so with subtle things that annoy us about other people, subtle things about other people's action and conduct that we think is inherent to our path, our goals, or anything. And it's really not. It's not inherent to any of that. I think the only thing it is inherent to is your own mind, your own bias about yourself, and our constant compounding upon this idea that who we are is constantly a reference point to everything around us. When who we are is the point. Who we are is where we're supposed to be. And I think, you know, accepting yourself as you are is an important thing so you can be where you are. You know, I think the whole act of being is not necessarily a preoccupation or even an awareness of you being present. It's you being able to be present by accepting yourself where you are. By you not constantly acknowledging the future or past, and recognizing that anything you have to gain, if it's not currently here, then your objective should be to do your best where you are and await its arrival. Not necessarily await in the sense of, oh, I'm waiting for this to happen, and constantly, again, acknowledging distance from your goals, but in a way, giving your goal to yourself as you are now. Accepting to yourself that it's something that's going to work in your favor, going to work out, going to appear in your life, so long as you're consistent, so long as you're intent, being present enough to choose the things that actually lead to it. You know, I think some of that present choice can often be done without your, you know, present effort. I think that when we actually commit ourselves to achieving a certain thing in regards to our goals, in regards to who we are, then we sort of already act in a way that's befitting of that certain something. And when I say that, I really just mean that when we attune ourselves and align ourselves with what we actually want, we're permitted with opportunities to get it. We're permitted with opportunities to see opportunities that we can create. And I think the biggest abstraction from our ability to achieve is always our inability to accept ourselves, our inability to see where we are and be where we are. You know, it's not about seeing the life, it's about being it. It's not about thinking, it's about being. And that's another thing. When we get so caught up in our thought about anything, it often has more harm than good. And I think if we recognize that most of our goals can only be achieved through certain actions, then what is the objective in constantly just thinking about those actions or thinking about our dream rather than moving towards it? Doing your best and doing what you can with what you have isn't to say not acknowledge your dream, not acknowledge your goals, where you want to go, but recognize that the only place you get there is where you are. And it's about not dampening the value you have for yourself in reference to that goal. And I think a lot of us do that as well. You know, we get in the habit of thinking that we're not complete until we achieve these certain things. We're not complete until we receive our dreams. But you're already complete where you are. It's never about what you receive. It's about what you give to both yourself and the world. And I think the biggest act of giving that we can give ourselves is perspective. Being able to see in the world what we carry in our hearts at times. And I think sometimes what's carried in our heart is ambiguity. I think sometimes what's carried in our heart is doubt in reference to what we are actually able to achieve and possess. And I think in that way, we try to play future predictor. We try to act as if we know exactly what's going to happen in the past when we know nothing of what, or the future. When we know nothing of what's going to happen in the future. We don't know hardly anything but what's right now. And even that sometimes can be misconstrued based on your biases. So I think it's about being present enough to also recognize your bias. Being accepting enough of your biases to actually mitigate them. To be able to look at certain situations and say to yourself, ooh, I might be looking at this in a twisted way based on this, that, and the other. And in that way, you're permitting yourself to see things how they actually are rather than how you are. And then you can see pathways to your goals, pathways to your aspirations in ways that are sometimes beyond your previous thoughts and notions. And I don't even think it's about constantly trying to look for opportunities. It's just about being where you are and loving yourself while you're there. Because that's really all we need to do. And then when opportunity does arise, it's about being present enough to see it. Not present enough to seek it out. Not present enough to put all your effort and time into it. Just present enough to see it. And I think that's where true hints of manifestation and true hints of alignment really walk in. I think it's only once you believe enough in yourself to drive your belief by being present. To say to yourself, oh, I'm going to achieve this. And instead of constantly thinking, oh, I'm going to achieve this, I have to achieve this, just being where you are and saying to yourself or accepting to yourself that something is going to be achieved because that's what you're going to tend towards. That's what you're going to do your best at. That's what you're going to go all into. This is your sign to go all in. It's really just all about being able to let yourself go to be in the moment. Letting yourself go to experience your life, your message, your journey. And, I've been reading a lot of poetry, prose from great thinkers that I acknowledge as great. And I was reading some Ram Dass, and he was talking about how his life is his message. And Gandhi was saying the same thing. And what that means to me is recognizing that it's not about heeding messages from the world. It's not about, getting some type of universal note card. It's about being the note card. It's about understanding that your way can only be paved by you. Your path can only be walked and explored by you. Your story isn't being written into the future. It's being written into where you are right now. And I think a lot of us tend to have this idea to think that everything's already mapped out. And to some extent it is. Because it is going to be a way. It is going to be a certain way. And I think that certain thing is just dependent on our ability to be present enough to choose what leads to that. And I think all of our ability to choose, all of our ability to be who we are, stems from our ability to accept who we are. I think if there even is, I won't even say the slightest, when we are at odds with ourselves in reference to everything that we experience, then everything we experience will be at odds with us. If you hate the world, it hates you back. Not in the sense to say you're constantly going to experience things that are referenced to hate, but to say that if you hate what you experience, you're going to feel that hate. And that's why I think it's about being accepting of where you are and who you are and learning to love that as a very prerequisite. Therefore, any experience, any situation, anything that you get yourself into can be filled with you rather than some type of feeling that you find unbefitting. All that to say thank you. And I hope you guys, to at least a subtle extent, learn to thank yourselves for being here, for being you, and continuing to do what you can with what you have. Thank you. Keep being great. Make sure you're taking care of yourself, doing what you can, what you have. A lot on the way, a lot already here. Book on the way. One more thing.